Welcome everyone to the session, Severing Family Bonds Through Terminating Parental Rights. We are honored to have with us today Kathleen Creamer, Managing Attorney for the Family Advocacy Unit, Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, Sharonda Salavanoff, Social Service Manager for the Washington State Office of Public Defense Parents Representation Program, Sherry Fremont, Managing Director, Judicial and National Engagements for Casey Family Programs, and Vivek Sankaran, Clinical Professor of Law, University of Michigan Law School, and Director of the Child Advocacy Law Clinic and Child Welfare Appellate Clinic. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And Kathleen, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Kendall, and welcome everybody. We're really glad you're here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm also really looking forward to doing as much as we can to get to know you all in the audience. So as we get started, what I would love is if you are open to it to put your name and your role in the child welfare system in the chat. And then if you want to share any thought or question you have about termination of parental rights, we would love to hear it. I am going to be moderating this conversation today, and I'm going to keep an eye on the chat as we go forward. And try to leave some extra time at the end, like the last 15 minutes or so, to really make sure we get to all your questions. But I want to just take a moment to introduce myself and my perspective a little bit, and I'll just let our panelists tell you a little bit more about them and what they do. So I'm Kathleen Creamer. I manage the Family Advocacy Unit at Community Legal Services of Philly. And I have been doing this work with families for almost 2 decades, representing parents in child welfare cases. And I'm really fortunate to know our panelists, who I'm going to just call on to introduce themselves and share anything they'd like to share about their own experience in the child welfare system. And I'll start with Sharonda.
Good afternoon and good morning for some folks, maybe for 3 more minutes. I know this is international, so that might not be true. I'm in the US. I'm Sharonda Salavanoff, and I actually just recently got a promotion. So I'm actually the Chief of Parent Initiatives at the Washington State Office of Public Defense Parent Representation Program. I am also a reunified parent, so I have lived experience navigating the child welfare, and I'm also a former kinship caregiver. My grandson's dependency ended with a guardianship, with me being granted custody. That's how we achieve permanency. But also I'll just share, because this has to do with our actual session, that my grandson's mother's rights were terminated over Zoom with no legal representation. So this session has a very intimate part of my life and very personal, and grateful to be in a space with all.
How about Sherry?
Hi, good afternoon. Sherry Fremont, coming today from Chicago. So I'm in a hotel room while I'm on travel. I currently work for Casey Family Programs, which is a national organization aimed to reduce the need for foster care. My relationship with Casey Family Programs began when I was a child. I was part of a family in which my young cousin became an orphan, and we became extended, like our family became extended family, formal caregivers, I suppose. And we were serviced through a Casey Family Programs office in Portland, Oregon, in which we got really good supports into how to be a new, different style of family in that formal relationship as kin caregivers. I've been an informal caregiver for most of my adult life as well. But my legal background, I specialized in Indian law as a tribal person when I went to law school, and I always wanted to serve tribal communities. And I ended up getting an opportunity to do that after some time being a stateside child abuse prosecutor. So in my tribal experience, there was a larger tribe that I worked for that I was suddenly in charge of a child welfare division, the legal side anyhow. And I learned a lot about the impact of genocide, assimilation, and multi-generational trauma, and the desperate attempts that communities make to try to respond to those answers of complex human experiences, and have been a part of termination of parental rights on behalf of the tribe. So my experience is complex and it's a long journey, but I'm trying to be as reflective as possible in today's space.
And how about Vivek?
Good afternoon, everyone. Vivek Sankaran. I direct the Child Advocacy Law Clinic at the University of Michigan Law School. I started my career representing children in the foster care system in Washington, D.C. at an organization called the Children's Law Center. Came to Michigan really to sort of dig more deeply into issues affecting parents in the system. And now much of my work is representing parents in termination of parental rights appeals. And so as I was telling my fellow friends on the panel, I'm really fired up to have this conversation right now. I'm in the middle of reading transcripts in appeal after appeal and termination of parental rights cases. And it's really sparked perhaps the most intense reaction that I've had personally reading through these transcripts, because I just see a lot of suffering, needless suffering that's being inflicted by our systems. And I just can't wait to dig in more deeply into these conversations with all of you.
All right, well, let's dig in, and please feel free to use the chat, you all. We're really glad you're here. But I just want to start with some kind of initial framing questions, and I have questions about all sorts of aspects of TPR that we're going to dig into. But Vivek, I want to start with you and hear from you, because you started your career as a children's attorney probably around the same time I did a couple decades ago. And I'm wondering, what do you know about TPR that you didn't know at the beginning of your career?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Kathleen. So the short answer is, I didn't know anything when I first started my career and what the heck I was doing in terms of representing children. I came in with an incredibly naive and narrow view of what child advocacy was, focused on the child, almost independent from the family unit. And really what happened was that the children that I worked with educated me about this concept that came on over and over again, which is the importance of relationships. And what I heard from my clients and the kids that I represented, and I saw, when they were with their families, is the sanctity of that relationship between a child and a parent. And then as I transformed into someone who represented parents, I saw both the value of that relationship, but also the harm that was inflicted by unnecessarily severing it in any way, and the damage that really inflicted on kids and parents. And so I think what I didn't know, just the kind of the short answer, is the loss that kids experience every single day by our systems taking away relationships, even in situations where parents might not be able to care for their children because of a multitude of life reasons, right? Addictions, mental health, physical disabilities, homelessness, poverty, you name it. There are a lot of things going on in people's lives that are beyond their control that prevents them perhaps of safely caring for their children. But what I saw with my clients is they still wanted to have relationships with their parents. And there was still such immense value in protecting those relationships. And that's the thing that's really top of mind right now. The idea that, are we as a system doing everything we can to really safeguard those relationships whenever possible? And that's where I have my biggest concern.
Yeah. I want to hear from Sharonda. I'm going to quote something Sharonda wrote in the Family Justice Journal recently. If you guys haven't downloaded this and read it, please do. It's in the bibliography. She wrote a phenomenal essay for the Family Justice Journal. But I want to read one piece of what Sharonda wrote and ask her a question about it. So you wrote an essay called Love Does Not End. And Sharonda, you said, families and people are always in a state of change. Messy, complicated, joyful change. If we leave open the door to change, we can welcome healing. How have you seen TPR practices undermine the chance for healing for families?
Thank you for that question, Kathleen. So yeah, I just want to center us back into the title of the article, right? Love does not end. And what I know is that we as people are an evolutionary species, right? And so we start one way, time changes, our wisdom is gained, we age, all types of things happen to us during a lifespan. And so in that evolution, what I know is that I'm learning and I'm growing, and we all are, that includes children, that includes parents, that includes communities. And what I know about TPR is that ultimately the goal is to adopt and to have some level of finality so that, children can, have a new set of parents. And the idea that we as people have the arrogance to think that we can stop what evolution has put in place, which is evolution has assigned, or creator has assigned, a mom and a dad. And that mom and dad are, you only get one. That's the set you get from the moment that you get here. And when I think about the place where TPR comes in and says, you don't have those anymore. We have terminated, and listen to that language, terminated, obliterated. No longer do you have the right, the human right to call your mom and your dad. That is, it's such a state of sorrow. And I think what we do is we sentence people to a state of sorrow that we believe we've done something good, right? By, freeing up this family or freeing up these children so that they can have these new beginnings. There are no new beginnings, right? We get what we get and we have what we have. And what we should be doing is helping people to, take the hand that they've been dealt and support, love, and walk along folks. What TPR does is it just leaves this gigantic hole inside of folks. And what we have is, as a society, that you will see walking with a gigantic hole. When you see substance abuse, and when you see the unhoused, and when you see exacerbated mental health, right? Like, ultimately, there are events that have contributed to all of that, right? So I recognize that for myself as a woman who's had multiple stages of my life, right? Like, the most transform, you know what I'm trying to say, has been not that I got it right, but that people welcomed me back on my road to recovery to reclaim, the places where I got it wrong. And that has catapulted me into a place of sanity, security, worth, determination, integrity, like all of those pieces that make me who I am have all happened because of healing. And if we close the door on healing, right, we close the door on the person's evolution to the next phase of their development or whatever that might look for them. So that's what I have.
I love that. I love that word sorrow, and I think we're going to circle back to that in a little bit when we think about the experience of both kids and parents in the system. Sherry, I want to hear from you. You're a member of an Indigenous tribe. You're a tribal judge. How have those identities all influence how you think about termination of parental rights?
Well, like most tribal people, my generation, maybe all of us actually, generation, we continue to navigate a colonized world. And sometimes we have been swimming in the water of colonization that we aren't even able to necessarily see it. So when I studied law, it was a big, a new world for me. I didn't know any lawyers, and so I go to this space and I learn about so many things, including the history of the legal status of tribes and the legal justification of things like genocide and forced assimilation. I I didn't know that. And so a lot of Native people don't, or most of us in this country don't know the history and the legal justification, some of these terrible parts of American history that really intended for me to not be able to be here today, or any of my relatives. I mean, full annihilation was often the goal. And knowing that, and knowing the way that children were used to force assimilation by separating families and using children as tools, is a really difficult piece of information to process and understand where you fit along that timeline. So I knew that my great-grandparents had been sent to boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is a long way from where our tribal communities were. And they were very young. And the idea that one of my relatives died at only age 12 there, away from her parents, alone. And knowing that that was a governmental intention out of benevolence. They thought that the argument was, this will be better for them. We know what's better for these people. Continues to be the premise of what we do with CPR today and the whole child welfare system. So, but when I first got out of law school and started practicing, I believed that the practice of termination of parental rights would be rare and for extreme circumstances, in which pretty much everybody would agree that for this particular child, everybody was going to agree that something better needed to be done. And that, of course, didn't end up being the truth and the reality. Sometimes it is, in a very, very, very rare circumstance. And I still wonder if the government has any role in that, because I think we see these play out in those rare circumstances sort of organically and naturally outside of government intrusion, right? So people take the right actions for the children of their community, of their kin group, of their clan. People do that outside of the government. But so the more I learned about how that genocide and assimilation and colonization impacted my ancestors and their ability to have healthy parenting models, and the way that we had internalized racism and internalized pain, made it really difficult for us to heal. And so I believe that me now in 2024 as a mother am barely claiming back what it means to be able to be a whole parent for tribal people. And it didn't happen overnight. My dad raised me with complexities. And he had a lot of challenges in his role as a parent. My auntie, when my cousin had to come to live with us, died of cirrhosis at 42 from drinking herself to death. We had also experienced a child death in that home. We had a lot of complex trauma that we luckily were able to heal together, and we continue to heal together. And we were able to escape that without government intrusion, at least in my generation. So I'm able to view it now as another tool that's a remnant or an updated version of this idea of government benevolence, that we still want to believe that all of us that are doing this work are doing it for the right reasons and that we just care about kids. But I'm here to tell you, I don't think the United States government has ever cared in a deep way about humanity. And I know that's a tough pill to swallow, but I don't see it today, and I don't think I can find it in our human history where we've really shown up for human relations. That's a complicated and loaded answer, but I know for sure termination of parental rights by the government against a family is not a healing process, and it never was intended to be.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Just want to say, we have lots of folks in the room, lots of different roles in the child welfare system. You guys are calling out the kind of myth of benevolence of the child welfare system. Dorothy Roberts, an acclaimed scholar, calls the child welfare system as operating on something called benevolent terror. And I repeat that not to malign the work of anybody in this room, but to invite you to wonder why parents and children would call what we're doing to them terror. It's worth reflecting on as we do our work. I want to dig into kids, right? And termination of parental rights and the impact on kids, because I think there's a sense of the harm, and I hope you all listened to Shanta Trivedi's presentation this morning, or we'll get to it eventually, on the harm to parents of the child welfare system, which is real, it's concrete. I'm confronted with it every day in my practice. But also, we have this system that's ostensibly designed to serve kids, and we're learning more and more about the harm that termination causes to kids. So I want to spend some time in conversation about that. So I'm just going to open this question up to the group. Sometimes people recognize the harm of TPR and say, well, it can be harmful, but it's also necessary for a child's well-being. But what do we know about the experience of termination from the child's perspective? What have we learned? And I'll open up to anyone in the group who wants to.
Well, I can start, Kathleen. I think I wanted to first make sure, because I know there's a diverse audience on these calls, that I think that all of us can agree that none of us want kids to be unsafe or unstable in any way, right? I didn't get into this work, as such a pro whatever, advocate that I was sort of agnostic or I didn't care about the well-being of children. I come at this work and my work on TPR because I care about children. Because I care about, and I think it goes back to sort of the point that I was making in the beginning, which is what I hear my clients telling me, both children and parents, and what I see is children are, and I think what the research backs up, is that children are longing for relationships with those that they love. But as Sharonda sort of pointed to, they want to see their parents heal. They want to be around for that when that happens and have that relationship. And so I think there's been a ton of research done on the idea of relational permanency. The idea that what kids are calling for is for the people who love them to be available to them in their lives. And that could mean that they live with them, but it also might mean that they live somewhere else while that healing happens. And I would really draw people's attention to the information memorandum put out by the Children's Bureau a couple of years ago, where they really made, I thought, a very profound point, which is challenging our systems as to why are we forcing children to make choices between people that they love? Why it's really our lack of creativity in the process of trying to figure out arrangements that can give children what they actually need. And so really, I think that, both the relationships, and then we don't factor in the ambiguous loss that children have when their rights of their parents are terminated. We have this fiction that legally we've accomplished permanency and the kids will just move on. And what we know from our own lives and the lives of our clients is that human beings don't work that way. And my kids who I represent, who have rights to their parents terminated, are still asking questions, all the time. They're like, well, when am I going to get to see my mom again? And as kids get older, that need only intensifies. And I would also point out that in this era where we're all connected, maybe 20 years ago it was almost impossible to find human beings. That doesn't exist anymore. I represent a kid right now in Ann Arbor who found his biological mother, his rights to her were terminated 11, 12 years ago, and he's still in foster care. And the power of Facebook and social media and all that means that our fiction is becoming eroded, even every day, even more and more and more, based on how the world is changing.
Yeah, the question makes me think about my grandson. And every time he sees his mom, it's not very often, right? He goes and he, greets his mother and loves on his mother. And nowhere in this little boy's mind is that not his mom. But there's a document, right, that says she doesn't have legal rights to him. And what I'd want us to kind of grapple with is the conversation at some point that I'm confronted with to have with him, if ever, right? Time will tell if that's a conversation that needs to be had. But how do I explain to a kid, right, that your mom doesn't have legal rights to you anymore, right? I hope that, we're not confronted with that, but somewhere along the lines, because he lives with his grandma, right, he's gonna have to ask that question, and I'm gonna have to have some answers. And thinking about how a little heart has to package that and make sense of that, it's pretty devastating. It's a devastating notion to have to think through. So as a protector and as a love, there's no one, I've got such a special place with my grandson. I don't want to be a part of having to navigate that level of pain for him, but it's inevitable. And to be honest with you, right, like, we're one of the lucky ones because at least he has access, right? So that's what comes up for me.
I think about it in the term of rights, which of course are a social construct, the way we look at them in this legal practice. And I think when I first got in, when I had to do the first few TPRs in the tribal community, I viewed them simply as what that seems to write on paper. So I thought it would mean they wouldn't have a right to be in the court hearing all the time, so we didn't have to wait to keep giving them service for absent parents. I didn't envision it being a termination of the whole relationship, because in the tribal community, everybody knows everybody. So you can say that they terminate your mother's rights, but everybody knows that's still your mother. So it was a complex way of thinking about it. And maybe that was to soothe all of us. I don't know. But it was more like relinquishing custody in my mind. But when you see a child who then gets adopted to non-native people or people that are not kin related, that severance, that loss is beyond just a piece of paper that says that there's no rights now. It's, man, like, I'm a child of my great grandparents and my great great grandparents, and they're connected to my descendants, and we're all one thing. We're all one thing. And to sort of banish this child into a different life, crossing our fingers and hoping that they figure it out, and somebody will take them to a powwow and teach them about jingle dancing or something, which may or may not even have anything to do with their particular people, is just devastating. And so, most of us will say we don't practice this in tribal communities. Because we don't do it. Well, I hope we don't. We do. Some do, of course. But you can't sever that relationship, really. You can practice it, you can pretend, but that connection is real and it exists whether or not some of us put it on paper or not. But all we really do is hurt it. And I believe most of them will come home, but they will suffer so much grief and sorrow and loss and pain. And so, yes, the parents suffered, but absolutely, I believe the children suffer just as much, if not more, and their children and their children and their children. That loss of connection as to who are your people cannot just be wished away because somebody has more money or somebody has a more stable household. Like, my identity, for me anyway, is connected to everything that my ancestors have done. And their healing, their pain, their struggles, their triumphs are mine. And so when we remove a child from that because their parent is ill or is suffering the consequences of that, I can't see it as anything other than continuing genocide. So we're punishing the crap out of people because they didn't heal fast enough for our liking. And I think we're desperate to heal. Tribal people, and I know Black people in the same experience, in a very parallel experience, we're desperate to heal. We want these pains to go away. We want the terrible terrors of the past to be over and done with. So the simple answer sometimes is to blame the thing that's right there in front of us, our own relative that we're so angry at because we can't see their brain, because we can't see how that has manifested in their body. We're so angry at them. We're just tired of it, and we want them to fix it. Because I've been guilty of that too, of not having compassion and understanding for my own people that I love deeply, my own relatives that I love deeply, for not being able to get it together enough for a kid. So we put this fast, quick fix in there, and people will say 24 months isn't quick enough, or 30 months, however, the longest permanency you can have, that's a quick fix for trying to fix all this complex pain, because the hard work is to love us through it. And that's hard. It's hard for all humans, but it's really hard for traumatized people.
The idea of termination is really an idea that we are ending your identity as a child of this parent, right? It is a real shift in identity for kids. And some kids are able to find their birth parents, but a lot of kids experience having their birth parents banished from their lives, right? What does that do to kids, to that idea of you are no longer a member of this family? We have changed by legal order your identity. What does that do to kids?
Well, Kathleen, I mean, one thing that I wanted to kind of frame for the audience as well is we've been talking about termination as if it's like, not intentionally, but like one fact pattern. And like, so one thing that I think people need to recognize is, first of all, I know there are various degrees of involvement in the child welfare system in the crowd. Only about 8 to 10% of cases at most involve serious physical or sexual abuse. The overwhelming majority of termination cases that our clinic sees do not involve any serious abuse. They are issues like addiction, mental illness, poverty, right? One of the cases we're appealing right now, our client permanently lost her rights because she didn't have suitable housing. She lived in a hotel room, and the trial court determined that was not suitable, and she lost rights to her child permanently. And so I wanted to make sure people understand that that the majority of cases we're talking about here do not involve serious abuse. I also wanted people to understand that in the United States, like about a third to 30 to 35% of all adoptions out of foster care are where we've terminated parental rights are with relatives. And so we're not even reserving this thing in those cases where we have to, where our lack of creativity means a stranger is adopting this child and you want to like cut the whole family unit out and start over again in that fiction. We're doing this even when kids are placed with grandma or the aunts and uncles. And so this idea of we're creating something new. We're not really creating anything new. This is just a family. And yet we feel this urge to get our ounce of blood in our systems, of not just saying we're going to place a child who's safe and stable with a family member, and everything is okay with this child now because they're in a place that is good for them where they can start to heal as well. But then we go one step further and say, no, we're, to this kid, we're not just going to get you to a place that's safe and stable. Now we're going to inflict this additional pain of making your mom or dad a legal stranger to you. And so I want to make sure how, as people think about this conversation, how that this is like 30% of our cases right now where we're still doing this. Families figured this out, right? Family has, and then what we've done is created incentive structures that then completely sort of manipulate in a way the intentions of family members and almost pits them against each other by saying, well, if you want the subsidy, well, you have to then, declare your intent to adopt, because adoption subsidies require that we rule out adoption, and you can adopt, so why don't you? And think about so I see this in my cases where people just turn on each other, and we watch them do that because of money, because of people talking them into it, saying you don't really want to deal with that parent after, and because it's not life. I mean, I think Sharonda in her quote said it best, which is like, change is messy and complicated. And it is, all of our lives are, but we've almost like tried to pretend that and create systems that like avoid that messiness and complication, but it doesn't really. It just makes it messy and complicated in a different way.
Yeah, I just want to just piggyback a little bit and just say, through the dismantlement as one mechanism to destroy a family, the government goes as far as to just have the family implode on each other. And to navigate the system and family dynamics and raise a child is a Herculean endeavor. And I will just tell you that, as a grandma who stepped in and said, this kid cannot go into foster care, and stepped in and actually changed the law so that the state would not be able to force me to adopt my grandson. If I could convey to you the amount of misunderstanding and volatility that I had to endure to keep us intact, it's unreal. And I'm like an anomaly because I'm so, embedded in the system. We set this thing up in a way where a child, right, who is the center focus of this is the conduit of pain. And it is not, intentional on a child's behalf, but the centerpiece here just reverberates this amount of sorrow, misunderstanding, volatility, navigation. It is absolute pure insanity. And if you don't have someone in the middle of this thing that can hold on to something to try to keep this together, this whole thing, even in the moment of the benevolence of let's get children to kin, that adoption piece in the middle of that is not benevolent. It is absolutely evil, and it can turn people's lives absolutely inside out.
I love that conduit of pain. I'm writing down everything you're saying, Shonda. Sorrow. It's such an important word to keep in mind when we're talking about what we're doing to families. Sherry, did you want to comment?
I was just going to say, of all of the people in my close proximity of life that have been forced into adoption and TPRs, like my relatives and friends that have had this, those kids, when they turn teenagers, they all blame the adoptive relative or the adoptive parent. Even if the government really forced it, they're sort of angry at their adoptive parent that you did this to my real mom or my bio mom. And that is a very painful and complicated, because I feel like we also disempower kin in that space, but the adoption subsidies and the other ways we threaten them that they'll lose the kid and somebody else will do more permanent. We do all these kind of twisted manipulations. And the child doesn't know that when they're 15 and 16 or 14, whatever. And in my experience, so many of them blame their adoptives. And some of them, though, hold such deep pain about it, but they aren't able to share it until after those parents are deceased or until they're in adulthood. So, of course, there's great stories, and those are the ones that make movies about, right? And I don't know why we as a field, or actually even as communities, why aren't we more honest about these pains?
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the pain that parents experience as well. I don't want to leave that off the table. I want to start by quoting, the legendary parent activist Joyce McMillan, who says that no system designed to help children would mimic a system that tortures parents. And as someone who's borne witness to the experience of termination of parental rights for parents, it is soul crushing. And I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about what does it look like for parents to be encountering a system that enacts the civil death penalty 50,000 times a year in the United States of America.
So When I was looking at this question, Kathleen, the thing that came to me was I was thinking about the parents that I used to work with when I worked in community with families that were navigating child welfare. And I remember this one mom, and her rights were eventually terminated. She had done everything. She'd done absolutely everything she was asked to do. But that timeline, right, came and went, and her daughter was, removed and subsequently adopted. She was so confused, right? She just was so confused, right? And I couldn't help her make sense of it because it didn't make sense, right? And so, children are like this wonderful agent of they're agents of healing, they're agents of love, they're agents of humor, they're just agents of all of these things, right? That we need in our lives, right? For growth and for healing, right? And when you remove that, you remove this amazing being to help me be all that I can be, right? We remove that, and children do that for us. And so when I think about her in particularly and the love she had for her daughter or has for her daughter, because it doesn't end, I watched her immerse herself in a DV relationship. And that was one of the issues. And when there was nothing left to fight for, she just went all in. She just went all in, right? And some may think, that suffering is warranted. I don't think that's a humanity I just don't think that that's a way anybody should think. And when we decimate parents, there is a part of them that assigns that they are unworthy of any good. Mm-hmm. And they will literally seek it out to confirm that belief. Because the one person that Creator gives us, right, which I just love, is like these kids. And these kids say, in all your imperfections, you're perfect for me, right? It is such a healing and necessary piece of us. And when you remove that, you literally take a piece of a human being that they will never be able to get back. And because they'll never be able to get it back, they'll never try for something better, because they'll just say, this is all I get.
Yeah, Kathleen, just to sort of echo that, your question is pretty raw for me because of an experience we're having in our clinic right now, which is, we finished reading transcripts in an appeal, and we think it's one of the strongest, most sort of horrible examples of overuse of TPR, and we think we're going to win the appeal, and we feel really good. We haven't been able to track down our client, and through sleuthing on the internet, and we finally tracked her down. We're excited to meet with her to share with her what we have discovered. And the response we got from her was, I don't want to fight anymore. I don't need somebody to tell me that I'm a bad mother again. And this isn't, it's not surprising to me, because this is often what I hear from I often get families after their rights have been terminated to work on appeals. And so but it was just devastating to think of this mom who my students, after reading the transcripts, walked away thinking, what a phenomenal human being to be able to raise children despite all that life has thrown at her. And we can't wait to fight for her to get that response of, I don't need 3 more judges telling me that I'm not worthy of caring for my child. I don't want to fight anymore. And that's what I often hear this from the clients that I represent on appeal, is that, and what we I think forget, and Sharonda said it so eloquently, is these folks who we do this to, they have to go living their lives after we leave.
Yeah.
And this idea, this phrase that I read of disenfranchised grief, which is the type of grief where you feel this pain, but you don't have a community or an outlet to support you through that pain. And so I think of another case that we have right now where kids are placed with the father, who my client is still in a relationship with him, but her rights have been terminated now. The other kids were placed with her mother, who is her other support person. And we have taken away the two people in her life that are her anchors for her sobriety, for her homelessness. And as a system, not only do we terminate parental rights, we often tell these caregivers, by the way, if you allow this person to get near these children, you are then putting yourself at risk of CPS involvement. Think about like going through the heart, maybe the thought experiment for the folks on this audience is think of the people who are closest to you. And then think about a time in your life where you have struggled beyond belief. And then we told you cannot talk to those people. You can't use them for support. And then wish them the best of luck to get through life. Like none of us can do life on our own. We all need the supports. And what we're doing when we often terminate parental rights is taking away those supports for people who need them at their most vulnerable time. And it is really hard to be a witness to that. I suspect that if everyone saw what all of us have seen through our work by being proximate with other human beings, we would have a different system. But what do people do? They insulate, right? Judges insulate themselves from the actual messiness of the situations. Caseworkers and lawyers do that as well, so we don't have to grapple with some of these realities.
I want to kind of dig into racial justice a little bit. You guys are all phenomenal advocates for social and racial justice, and we've kind of really talked about the harm to kids and practices that emphasize TPR. We've talked about the harm to parents. What about the intergenerational harm that happens when we have patterns of termination of parental rights in marginalized communities? I just want to frame this question by acknowledging that we don't treat families the same when it comes to termination of parental rights. So TPR happens uniquely often with our most marginalized communities. So we know American Indian and Alaska Native children are 2.7 times more likely than white kids to experience termination. Black children are 2.4 times more likely than white children to experience termination. And of course, across other marginalized identities, we see higher rates of termination, like families facing parental disability, very high rates of termination. What does that say about the values that we're bringing to the table as termination of parental rights decisions are getting made?
I think we don't value different types of humanity. Like there's been one set of human individualism culture that this country wants to see amongst families and the power structures that have designed these systems. And anything that looks different, there's just like, we're just going to keep on forcing it. We're just going to keep on forcing it, even though we might have put into the soil of what cultivates there things they can't recover from. We still expect them to, or we want them to adapt. So in my culture, we don't have a structure of parent and child as a one-way, like parent down. Like many people serve parental roles to you, or the caregiving community is more than just one mom or one dad. Yes, today we have a lot of single parents, but the reality is but that never fit this structure of the child and neglect system in the United States. So even when we can't compare our ways of life, our value system and our shared responsibility system doesn't fit an individual capitalistic system. And we value things that look like that and also look the white way, for lack of a more explicit comparison. One of the questions I continue to ask, and I've not heard a competent answer yet, is because of course there are white children in this system. Of course there are white families that have been struggling with a lot of challenges as well. I believe that the most way we're disproportionate is in government enforced multi-generational trauma. I believe that government has forced intergenerational trauma us massively disproportionately. So our health outcomes, our social determinants of health outcomes, are clearly hitting as designed. And so when people address disproportionality with this big quizzical look on their face, like, what is it? What is it? Why can't those Native families just love their kids better? I am so offended by, because you don't let us raise them the way we believe we're supposed to, and you're not letting us heal. You're not helping us heal. And so we're just internalizing more and more and more pain from that colonizing structure. And that can also happen in white families. If you don't heal quick enough and it hits multi-generational, nobody's here to come help you. Not as a system anyway. So I think that's a little bit layered, but I'm curious. I'm super committed to the idea that it has much to do with government enforced trauma. Well, genocide, assimilation, slavery, all the other atrocities.
I think what I find a little bit interesting with this sort of where we're at in this moment of time is I feel like I've been to so many conferences like this where, in keynote speeches, you'll get sort of agency directors and judges sort of lament about all the sort of the social determinants of health and the inequities in society and how housing resources are not allocated fairly and jobs aren't allocated fairly. And the criminal justice system sort of disproportionately impacts, all the marginalized communities, and they'll go on and go on. And so it's almost like consensus recognizing these truths in the world. And then you get into juvenile court, and it's as if those things don't exist anymore. We have just forgotten. The same very people who are in front of big audiences talking about these things are, often directing agencies and workers to almost block out all those things because, we got a kid here. And then they just cycle through as if we don't know of those things. It's almost like this, we're asking, workers and judges and others to be sort of willfully ignorant of something. I think in this moment of time, like many coalesce around. And that is part of the hardest thing about child welfare. Think about some of the conversations you see in courtrooms about housing. Well, why don't you just go get a house, right? After we've been, told over and over and over again about how hard it is for folks to find housing or a job or addiction treatment. And yet we just put the blindfold on and individualize it to say to that parent, well, why didn't you do it? When we know that they can't do it because it doesn't exist. And that's when, of the many things that make this work really challenging, it's like reading about these conversations that have no place in reality because the things that people are asked to do cannot humanly be done by any of us in their circumstance.
Sean?
Yeah, I'll just take us back just a little bit further to us as a country, right? The United States has never valued families. It has never valued Black and Brown families. And when I look at TPR, it just mimics, right, that we can rip children and families apart and, that there are a group of decision makers or people who know what's best. Ultimately, I want to just say, the value that stands out to me more than anything about this system, because I think sometimes we forget that there is an incredible amount of trauma that occurs through family separation, but there's an incredible amount of harm that happens through adoption and through the separation of families. Right? There is exploitation that happens, there is child trafficking, there is all of these just incredible, terrible things that happen, once you remove folks out of a child's life that actually can check in, right? Are you all right? Are you, what's going on in your daily life, right? So ultimately, right, the value that, stands out for me is that we stand on this idea of goodness, but what we really want to do is remove all folks that actually serve as a protection to children.
And Kathleen, if I could just add on to what Sharonda has shared, also we haven't examined in this conversation. We've had this like almost underlying assumption as we're talking about TPR that it's going to like result in something like an adoption or a guardianship. And I just want to make sure folks on the call also recognize that there are thousands of kids in America's foster care system that we TPR on who don't get that. We make a promise to them that there's something better on the other side, and we don't give them that. We just terminate recklessly without any sort of permanent arrangement on the other side. And so, to complicate this conversation even more, you have like the group that doesn't find a home, and then you have like many kids who are adopted who then get turned back into the system or are rehomed because of issues, in that home, and often framed as this kid's acting out and we can't handle him anymore. And so I wanted to make sure that as we wrestle with the complexities of this, there's so many sort of nuances within this that we need to think about.
And Kelly, you mentioned also like the role of the racism, and I just want to identify, like, as a Native American lawyer here today, I'm a pretty rare bird in this field, in the legal field, particularly in the child welfare field. You probably can name the other handful of us that exist in this space. And I mean, that's another system that upholds white supremacy and the concepts of what love looks like, what families look like, and what the model family looks like, right? So children as commodities, and, the more money, the better. And that's the better standard for a home versus our different ways of viewing life. So it's easy to just say straight up racism, because that's absolutely a piece of it, but it's so embedded into every aspect of all of these things.
Yeah. And I want to go back to something Vivek said, because I think it's important to unpack a little bit. When you go to conferences like this conference, and actually conferences all across the country, post 2020, post George Floyd, you hear leadership of all the child welfare agencies and industries saying, yes, racism is real. Yes, there's a disproportionate impact on families. And you're right, Vivek, that doesn't translate into the lived experience of families on the ground when they confront child welfare courts. But what I also want to call out is, like, sometimes I feel like a sense of, like, what you were kind of identifying, Vivek, is like helplessness. Well, yes, it's disproportionate, but it's because there's racism everywhere else, right? Like, we're dealing with families who've been marginalized, who are dealing with intergenerational trauma, poverty. And so we're just showing up at the doorstep at this time. And so what are we supposed to do about that? I worry about that narrative very much, because I think there's something different every single person in this room could do tomorrow that would make a big difference. But also, I just want to grapple with it and name it, because I see it every day that I show up at a child welfare conference. And I'm wondering if any of you want to comment on that.
The exact same questions could be asked about climate change, sexism, all these other elements. And it can be incredibly overwhelming, right? So overwhelming to be like, how am I going to fix all of this? It's been in the makings for, hundreds of years. Like, how are we going to fix this? Me, you, and those of us who want to do the right thing. So I start with being really kind to myself so that I don't get overwhelmed with just depression and futility. And, that's real. And the second piece is, maybe I can start with, I'm just going to do less harm than I was doing yesterday, which might mean talking more, thinking more, and questioning more, being curious with my colleagues more, opening up the curiosity about how did these folks get into these terrible scenarios? What else do they need? Can we see their suffering? Can we see their humanity? Because the response that I'm afraid to say is probably not force. And that's a piece that I really struggle with, because I just want to force everybody to stop it, right? And we're going to keep fighting it. Vivek's going to keep doing it. We're all going to keep doing that. But I think we have got to. I love a lot of people on this planet who don't know enough about other people's suffering, and they don't know how to respond. So many of them want to respond with anger and quick fixes. They do, because they don't want any people to be suffering anymore. So I'm feeling less like listening to a lot of people justifying the system in my spaces. I'm hearing more people feeling overwhelmed with not being able to come up with a solution that people will accept. And so it sounds, I don't want to sound like I'm appeasing white supremacy and saying it's okay. I don't want to say that, but I also don't want to put individuals, because I appreciate that we can all be more, but I also don't want the oppressed to feel like they have to heal everybody else before they do. And so that's hard for me, right? We need to have grace for all of us, but I think we could all, a good friend of, well, somebody I value very well, spoke at a conference recently, and she's like, it may mean walking away. It may mean you shouldn't be doing this work at all. If none of us would do it, then what would happen? If none of us would take away children, then would they still be taken away? You know, that is a complicated question, and she asked it with full like curiosity. I wanted to be a prosecutor because I thought I could do it differently. I thought I could be the voice of victims like that came from backgrounds like mine, but coming to terms with one human body in that space was really hard. So that's, it's a good question, but it's a really painful question too.
Yeah, I'll just add that, first of all, I wanted to say, I think it's over 2 million children have had their rights terminated, right? This isn't a Black problem, right? Because there are white children and white families that also have had their parental rights terminated. The question I have for all of us to think about is, particularly when it looks at the issue in its entirety, is what can you do in your current work or position to assist in dismantling a system that perpetuates incredible harm to Black children, to Native children, to white children, to children, right? And I think at some points, you know, particularly when race comes into the dialogue, it gives people a little bit of an out, right? Particularly if that's not an area of interest, right? But I just want you to sit in your soul and just ask ourselves as people, where have we gone as a race where we're not outraged by any child being separated and harmed and abandoned by a system that proclaims protection and care when we have the evidence that says everything is to the contrary? This is a logical question. This is an emotional question. This is a physical question, right? Racial justice, social justice requires us to get up in arms and say, enough. This is unacceptable. And if enough folks come together collectively, we can make this change. What I'm reminded about, no matter what, is this system was created by man. So if it was created by man, it can be dismantled by man.
And I think, I mean, and maybe my goals of, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about this, for like what our system can do today to change, maybe are more modest. But, you know, I think even if we all got everyone in the system to pause for a second and just ask, why are we doing this?
Mhm.
We might actually have I would love to have the work towards a more radical restructuring, but like so much of what I see every day is that we have become processors of cases, that we don't stop and think. We're on the conveyor belt of court. So it's like, boom, it's been 12 months, permanency planning hearing. It's been 15 months. Oh, ASFA requires the filing of a petition. Let's schedule the date. Let's go. And what we need, and we have 139 people on this call. We need 139 people plus more to say, why? Like, how is that good for the kid? Is that fair to the parents? What about, what we know about how hard it is to find a house or a job or addiction treatment? Did we really give them a chance? We go through, if we can get enough of us to just stop and ask that question, perhaps, because people aren't. I can tell you right now, not enough people are asking the question of this doesn't make sense. Can we just pause for a second, right? I mean, I'll give you a very concrete example. In my housing case, our department has a program where they will offer to certain parents first month rent to address housing issues or down payment. But we have a client who can't afford housing. She has a job, but she can't afford enough. She doesn't have enough savings to make that first month sort of security deposit, all that stuff. The program is designed, though, that the parent has to front the money, and then the department will reimburse her. So the parent gets up there and says, I don't have the money to front the money. And so then the court says, well, I'm going to make a finding then that the parent has decided not to avail herself of this program. A department made reasonable efforts, and let's, she still has on suit. And you're just like, that's a choice point moment of a judge looking at a caseworker and asking, or a caseworker looking to their supervisor and asking, why is this program designed this way? And how will it actually address? And I think part of the cynical part of me, and I'm not a cynic most of the time, but part of me thinks we design the program that we want because we actually don't want people to avail themselves of this, because it gets in the way. We want just to process this stuff. But there are so many micro moments in the life of a case where if one person in power stops and says, why are we doing that? Or how does that make sense? It has the potential of dramatically changing how the entire case goes. We just need to find the people with the courage to do that.
I love that. And somebody who's been a family defense attorney for a long time, when I have had those brave caseworkers who've said, wait a second, why does grandma have to adopt? She doesn't really want to, right? Like, why can't we just do guardianship? Or wait a second, yeah, it's been 15 months, but mom's 2 months from getting discharged from her recovery. Like, why would we terminate parental rights? Like, just those people who are willing to insert those pauses in the conveyor belt can make an enormous difference in the lives of families right now with the system that we have. I am all for structural change, but there is something we can all do today. And I do want to, we'll definitely get to that at the end. I definitely want to spend some time talking about what can we all do today? What can we do in the next 5 to 10 years, right? Because it is easy to look at the harm, to look at the pain and feel hopeless and feel a little immobilized, but none of us should be. We're actually in a humanitarian crisis and we have a duty to act if we're in this system. I want to right now spend some time digging into the Adoption and Safe Families Act and really look at kind of the policy rationales for why we have a system that really prioritizes termination of parental rights. And I wanted to say to you guys, please continue, and our audience, please continue to put your comments and questions in the chat. I want to make sure to get to any questions that you do have as we go on. But let me just back up to 1997. The Adoption and Safe Families Act was passed, and it was designed to accelerate termination of parental rights so that more children had access to permanency. The ostensible goals of the Adoption and Safe Families Act were safety, permanency, and well-being for all children. And I feel like, we're within this scheme that was created at this point almost 27 years ago, and we've learned an awful lot since we had this idea that this would be the path to getting to wellness, well-being for kids. What have we learned since the Adoption and Safe Families Act was passed?
This is fascinating to me because I had a different type of exposure in a case study. I call it a case study. Because when I started working at a tribe, it was 2006 2006, I think, and 2005. So ASFA was only 8 years old or so, and tribes didn't take it on because it doesn't apply unless you apply for Title 4E. So we didn't have these permanency structures. So, but the hard press started coming to accept Title 4E so that tribal systems could be funded better. So I was bombarded with the evidence and the justification of what happens when when the term was on ice, like kids are just lingering out there. So the system I was in hadn't really done a deep dive into what was happening to children who were in long-term foster care. So we did look at what happened to children who were lingering in foster care, and we saw the kids that aged out, which is not necessarily who ASFA applies to today, but for children who had aged out after being in care for a lifetime, and their outcomes were abysmal. So the children who aged out from this case set that I was looking at were terrible. They were all, they'd been convicted of murder. They had been murdered. They'd been exploited. They'd been trafficked. I mean, it's terrible. So it fit at the time. The logic model fit because it was like, well, see, because you kept them in foster care all this time, you didn't give them relational permanency. So now it's been another almost 20 years. And I think I stole this from probably from some of Vivek's articles and et cetera, but the remedy has been worse than the disease here in that ASFA didn't fix per se the age out kids, because in my, those aren't the kids who are it's just added different harms to someone else. And that is a hard reality for people to accept. It is insanity that we created a timeline of how quick a human being has to heal from some really deep pain. And we don't there's very few statutes or clarity as to when do we let this child go back home. And we use the most wonky, squishy, ridiculous best interest test. So we don't even put real law around it or real clear guidelines around it. And we just throw it out there. But the one thing that's clear there is those timelines. So because the timelines are clear and lawyers like something clear that we can all measure, we just go for it. It's been a disaster. I would love to hear people defend ASFA today.
That's not hard, Sherry. You can find them everywhere you go. Believe me.
I know from certain angles, but from a broad impact, it's how can, and the people I want to listen to, the people that matter on this are the children who've been impacted and the parents and families who've been impacted. I don't really care what anybody else says. I really don't. And if they're not telling us en masse, yay, ASFA, then we have some reckoning to do.
So I have a couple of reactions, Kathleen. Mentioning ASFA has sparked so many things sort of in my mind. First, this is a point that Sharonda made earlier, which is, whatever humans have created, humans can change, right? We've made this mess. And I think what ASFA shows is ASFA has worked to accomplish what it has sought to accomplish, which is if you look at a graph, we look to increase TPRs and there's a huge uptick right post ASFA. And it was a successful piece of legislation for what they wanted to do. I think what we know now is the damage it's caused, but I think what gives me some hope potentially is that we can change that trajectory because this is within the control of, to a certain degree of legislation and fixing it. But I think there's a deeper issue though, so I'm all about, energy to get rid of ASFA because I think it's a step in the right direction. But I also think that there's almost a narrative that ASFA has created that lived before ASFA and will live after, which is this myth that adoption is the end all be all for all kids in foster care. That I hope that advocates realize that getting rid of a law is just a step, right? Because even if you look at ASFA right now, ASFA does not, none of those timelines are mandatory if a kid is living with a relative. Mm-hmm. But that hasn't stopped judges and others from just blindly seeking termination when kids are living with a relative. Because in their heart of hearts, they think they're doing right by kids. And so I think part of the struggle that I'm in right now is figuring out how do we reach these audiences to start sharing the pain that this has caused so that they actually believe that what they are doing is inflicting pain on kids. And maybe it's necessary sometimes, but unless they feel it, I just worry that we're investing all our time, and then they're just going to figure out another way, if they don't really believe it, to get around this. Because in states like Michigan, led the fight in getting ASFA enacted based on what we had done pre-ASFA. So even if we get rid of the Adoption Safe Families Act, we have legislation in our books that has existed since the mid-90s, and many states go beyond ASFA with the time limits, especially for younger children. You have states that are 6 months or less in terms of reunification efforts. And so it's a great step, but a lot of this is done on the state level, that we need to get advocates really speaking out about the harms that this is causing.
Yeah, and I'll just add, to get to a TPR moment, there's lots of things that have to happen before then. Lack of services, lack of supports, turnover of social workers, right? The guide to get me to my next place, legislators that are willing to fund social services, right? So I believe a large percentage of our families shouldn't be in child welfare in the first place. But if families make their way into child welfare, is it not the responsibility to have the services and supports necessary for me to get out of child welfare, comparably to this, incentivization, which also requires money, right, to terminate? It's like our objective is very clear just by where the investment is. And so there seems to be opportunities for helping legislators, community, public understand how the system has incentivized TPR, and to legislate the disinvestment in that and investment in the actual services and supports that assist families in healing. I want to just point out, the question earlier, we talked about intergenerational trauma. We understand that, a good percentage of these are just issues that are heaped on. And we don't have the investment for care for children and care for their families. And ultimately, my hope is, of course, repeal ASFA, but can we get what families actually need so that they can heal and be together as the type of family that they would deem, most favorable for them, based on having their needs met by us as community members and whatever types of funding that the government can provide along the way.
Yeah, I love all these answers. One, I totally agree with you. Whether we can repeal ASFA or not, and we should repeal ASFA, but it's really, the question is, what are the values we're bringing to the table when we think and engage with families? And unfortunately, the values have really been values that have not supported families staying together and kids doing well. Their right to lifelong connection to their own families has been completely disregarded. But I also want to call out, I'm an optimist. I do want to call out something else you said, Vivek, though. I think it's really important to realize that all of these structures are modern day creations, right? So ASFA happened in my lifetime. CAPTA happened 3 years before I was born, right? We created these structures and we can uncreate them. The idea that I think people again get immobilized and start to think, well, we're just stuck with this. We're not. We created this within my lifetime. We can uncreate it within my lifetime. I do want to spend some time talking about what everyone in the audience can do, but I do want to ask one final question before we move into what can you do as an audience member today? And I really want to ask you all something that Matt Anderson in his podcast has been asking a lot. Matt Anderson has a Proximity Process podcast, and he asks his guests often this question, and I think it's really iterative. What would happen if TPR was not available to us? What if we couldn't TPR? What if we just took that tool off of the table today? What would happen?
So a couple of things come to mind. One is that kids would continue to be safe and stable in the homes of people who love them. That wouldn't change, right? Regardless of whether we took TPR off the table or not. I think it would completely change many of the conversations that happen at the trial court level between agencies and agency caseworkers and parents, in that I think it would actually force people to work together towards reunification in a far more meaningful way than they do right now. Right now, we have this almost pretend dance where we have where we ask, we have a schizophrenic system where we're saying, yeah, we're really here to help you, but we're going to then terminate your rights when you fail. So you have, a person who might be tasked with reunifying that is also rooting for your failure because they can move on to what they really want as the option. And if we're taking away what they really want as the option and actually engaging in the messiness of the healing work, perhaps that might be something that is opened up if we took termination off the table. I also think termination off the table is just one of many things. I want to make sure that in terms of dismantling the system, that has to happen. But I also think that for my clients that I represent in the trial court, what happens in states like Michigan is on the first day of court, we tell a parent, a petition's filed. And by the way, if you don't do all the things they're asking you to do, we're going to file a petition to destroy your family forever. Now go work with that person and address, years of trauma and struggle. If we somehow got rid of and changed that conversation to say, listen, we want your kid to be safe and loved and stable, and we know you can do it, and our job is here to help you figure out how to do it, and we're never going to destroy your family, ever. That's not going to happen. And let us work with you. Maybe there's an opening there for a different type of relationship.
I would just say you would change practice, first of all, because instead of folks working in an effort to destroy families, they would charge to actually keep them together. I think that you would see a workforce that actually would enjoy their job a little bit better because they were actually working at helping families rather than hurting them. Most social workers who get into this work really come at this work because they actually want to be helpers, and then they end up being dismantlers. So I think just some folks' well-being would actually be a lot more on point. I think our children would certainly benefit. Whenever I think about the dynamics going on, and I always kind of go back to this one story because I remember when my son and his mom were just really, really hard. And I always look at my grandson, and he couldn't speak at the time, but he spoke with me, right? I would hear him, and it was like, Grandma, help my parents. Grandma, help my parents, right? He was like my beacon of you can withstand this, you can keep on going, right? You've got this little heart that is relying on me to help them. And I found that call to be an honor, right? That the Creator has said, Sharonda, I charge you with this, to show up in love, even when people are not at their most loveliest moments. And to be a demonstration of that, because that's what children need to see. That's what we need to see as a society. And that's what I need to be. All of that works together, right? When we as a energy move towards a place of healing, restoration, love in all of our activities, right? Despite the turmoil, and the turmoil has its own history. It's a foundation, right? It's come from someplace. And our activation comes from a different place, which is, I just want to be a part of making this different for all. And if we took TPR off of the table, right, it actually would be transformative, not just for families, but actually the folks, for people who actually work with families. I want us to remember this, right? Like each one of us does this work, and some people carry it with them for 9 to 5, and some people carry this with them 24/7. But ultimately, right, those ripple effects are operating in your communities, in people's homes, and in our society. All of this is connected. All of this is connected. And keeping the ties together is actually keeping us together. And I don't know about you, but watching the world that we live in right now, we desperately need that. Desperately need that.
So I know we only have 5 minutes left, and first of all, I just want to say to our audience a couple of things. First of all, I just want to thank you for joining us in this space and for listening to a very challenging conversation. And I really appreciate you staying with us as we kind of tried to take on some real big ideas in this session. I want to tell you a little bit about what's in your materials. I made a bibliography that's like, if you're just curious about what we've said today, there's lots of great reading, podcasting, law review articles out there. Like, please just check them out and think about them. I did, Vivek, this afternoon upload the permanency IM because I was like, how can we not have this as a material? So it is now a material. The federal government did put out an information memorandum that's very helpful, that's very concrete about guiding practice today under today's laws, and really reorienting our thinking when we're engaging with permanency planning for kids around kids' needs for relational permanency. So that's a great place where you can start today. The federal government has said, do it this way, right? And there's a lot of great stuff in there that I would highly recommend to you. Also, Vivek is too modest to mention his own law review article, but if you just want a primer on a lot of this, please read the law review article I also uploaded, which is The Ties That Bind Us. Really terrific piece of work that I highly encourage you to engage with. I want to finish us off with a question to our panelists, which is, because we're all calling out the kind of sense of sorrow, the sense of despair, the way that can really immobilize us, even as we are recognizing that significant harm is occurring. And I wonder if any or all of you want to talk about in our last 3 minutes about what can people in the audience wake up tomorrow and do differently?
So I'll start. I mean, I'm a big believer that each of us needs to find things within our control to do differently, to change. And really focusing on that will lead to a different world. And so, if you're a person who deals individually with cases, you can make different decisions about your cases tomorrow. You can treat human beings differently tomorrow. You can say no to a request to terminate tomorrow. You can do all of these things in your ambit, versus we might have legislators on this call or others, and depending on what your expertise is, right? People had asked in the chat about legislation or whatever it might be, right? Look at Minnesota and what they did recently to pass an act that will severely limit TPR. Look at what Washington State and Sharonda and all her great colleagues did with having a bill that promotes guardianship versus TPR. Really, though, it's and this is why I love sort of these the inner work that each of us has to do, is to reflect really on what can we do tomorrow. For me, it is being the force of resistance and taking as many TPR appeals as I can to educate people through the court system about how harmful this is. That's within my little square, but everyone has to figure out what can they start impacting tomorrow, because that'll create a different world.
Stay humble and be okay with the fact that you truly don't know. And your supervisors and the lawyers and all of those want you to sell it with full conviction. And they might tell you you're not doing a good enough job because you're not defending your evidence enough. It's okay to not know. This is somebody else's child. This is somebody's family. It's okay to not know. So stay in that space.
And I will just end by saying, for myself, I have legislated and educated, and my grounding force in all that I do is love. The wonderful article I wrote says love does not end. It has specifically to do with this subject matter. And I will tell you, love does not end. You please be the beginning. And that is for whomever that comes into your world. Invite that into every contact you have with a human being.
There is no better ending than that. Shonda, thank you so much. It's been a joy to hang out with you guys for an hour and a half, and just thank you to the audience too.
Thank you very much, Vivek and Shonda and Kathleen and Sherry. Thank you so much for all of this. Let me say to our attendees, to our participants in this, please fill out that survey. You'll see on the Attendee Hub page for this course a survey icon. And if you're getting continuing education units for this course, that's how you get those, is by filling out that very brief survey, which will have 3 quick questions for you. Thank you. Thank you again to our panelists, our presenters. Thank you so much. All of us, let's take what we've learned today and move forward. Thank you all. Thank you.